The wind howled through the narrow canyon, rattling loose stones and carrying a fine spray of red dust that stung Aiyana's eyes. She squinted against the glare of the setting sun, the sky painted in molten gold and deep violet as if the heavens themselves were on fire. Today, she would marry Silas Redhawk, a man whose name carried both fear and reverence across the plains. And yet, beneath the awe, a tension lingered like the acrid smoke from a dying fire. Everyone watching, from the townsfolk to the distant figures of the local Apache tribe, expected a spectacle. But what none of them knew was how fragile trust could be, especially in the Old West. Aiyana adjusted the worn ribbon in her dark hair, letting it flutter in the gusts that tore across the cliffs. Her dress, modest and pale blue, clung uncomfortably to her skin in the desert heat. She felt the curious eyes of the villagers on her, some whispering, some staring openly. Rumors about her past had already preceded her, and she could sense their judgment pressing down as heavily as the canyon's shadows. She breathed deeply, trying to steady her racing heart. Then she felt him before she saw him, Silas, standing tall at the edge of the cliff, his broad frame silhouetted against the sun. His eyes, dark and unyielding, swept over her, measuring, calculating, yet somehow searching for a hint of honesty in her gaze. Aiyana met him halfway, the canyon wind whipping between them, carrying a tension as sharp as the rocks beneath their boots. The ceremony was unconventional, no wooden chapel, no polished pews, no choir of angels. Only the canyon, the echoing cliffs, and the raw, open sky bore witness. The preacher, a grizzled man with sun-leathered skin, raised his hands and began muttering the vows, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. The echoes bounced off the rock walls, stretching the words into something sacred and strange, almost otherworldly. Aiyana felt her pulse quicken as Silas extended his rough, calloused hand. She hesitated for a moment, remembering all the whispers that had led her here, the loneliness of years spent surviving on her own, and the secrets that would soon be exposed. She took his hand, and the contact was electric, solid, unyielding, grounding. "You may speak your vows," the preacher said, voice trembling slightly against the canyon's roar. Aiyana forced a small, careful smile. "I promise to stand beside you, in the storms and the fire and in the dust of this land," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. The words felt heavy, but true. She wasn't just promising love, she was promising survival, loyalty and resilience in a world that had shown her little mercy. Silas's voice was low, gruff, and unwavering. "I promise to defend you, to respect your strength, and to honor the choices that brought you here, no matter what." His words carried weight, a mixture of respect and caution, as if he too knew how easily trust could crumble in these harsh lands. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the wind briefly still as the vows settled between them. A hush fell over the villagers and the silent observers among the Apache who had come to watch from a distance, their presence a quiet reminder of the land's long memory. When the preacher declared them married, the echoes of his words bounced off the cliffs like distant thunder. Aiyana and Silas stood hand in hand, the canyon stretching infinitely around them, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed paused, but the moment was deceptive. Aiyana could feel it tonight would not be a night of celebration. Secrets lingered like shadows, waiting to stretch and twist. The desert wind whispered warnings, rustling her dress and tugging at Silas's coat. The future was uncertain, the stakes high, and neither of them truly knew what lay ahead. Still, as the sun dipped below the jagged cliffs, bathing them in the last light of day, Aiyana felt a spark of defiance. She had survived the judgment of townsfolk, the harshness of the desert, and the ghosts of her past. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same stubborn courage that had carried her this far, and now, with Silas by her side, the canyon itself seemed to echo a promise. that survival could become something stronger than mere endurance. It could become trust, and maybe even love. The wind howled through the narrow canyon, rattling loose stones and carrying a fine spray of red dust that stung Aiyana's eyes. She squinted against the glare of the setting sun, the sky painted in molten gold and deep violet, as if the heavens themselves were on fire. Today, she would marry Silas Redhawk, a man whose name carried both fear and reverence across the plains. And yet, beneath the awe, a tension lingered like the acrid smoke from a dying fire. Everyone watching, from the townsfolk to the distant figures of the local Apache tribe, expected a spectacle. But what none of them knew was how fragile trust could be, especially in the Old West. Aiyana adjusted the worn ribbon in her dark hair, letting it flutter in the gusts that tore across the cliffs. Her dress, modest and pale blue, clung uncomfortably to her skin in the desert heat. She felt the curious eyes of the villagers on her, some whispering, some staring openly. Rumors about her past had already preceded her, and she could sense their judgment pressing down as heavily as the canyon's shadows. She breathed deeply, trying to steady her racing heart. Then she felt him before she saw him, Silas, standing tall at the edge of the cliff, his broad frame silhouetted against the sun. His eyes, dark and unyielding, swept over her, measuring, calculating, yet somehow searching for a hint of honesty in her gaze. Aiyana met him halfway, the canyon wind whipping between them, carrying a tension as sharp as the rocks beneath their boots. The ceremony was unconventional, no wooden chapel, no polished pews, no choir of angels. Only the canyon, the echoing cliffs, and the raw, open sky bore witness. The preacher, a grizzled man with sun-leathered skin, raised his hands and began muttering the vows, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. The echoes bounced off the rock walls, stretching the words into something sacred and strange, almost otherworldly. Aiyana felt her pulse quicken as Silas extended his rough, calloused hand. She hesitated for a moment, remembering all the whispers that had led her here, the loneliness of years spent surviving on her own, and the secrets that would soon be exposed. She took his hand, and the contact was electric solid, unyielding. Grounding. "You may speak your vows," the preacher said, voice trembling slightly against the canyon's roar. Aiyana forced a small, careful smile. "I promise to stand beside you, in the storms and the fire and in the dust of this land," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. The words felt heavy, but true. She wasn't just promising love, she was promising survival, loyalty, and resilience in a world that had shown her little mercy. Silas's voice was low, gruff, and unwavering. "I promise to defend you, to respect your strength, and to honor the choices that brought you here, no matter what." His words carried weight, a mixture of respect and caution, as if he too knew how easily trust could crumble in these harsh lands. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the wind briefly still as the vows settled between them. A hush fell over the villagers and the silent observers among the Apache who had come to watch from a distance, their presence a quiet reminder of the land's long memory. When the preacher declared them married, the echoes of his words bounced off the cliffs like distant thunder. Aiyana and Silas stood hand in hand, the canyon stretching infinitely around them, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed paused. But the moment was deceptive. Aiyana could feel it tonight would not be a night of celebration. Secrets lingered like shadows, waiting to stretch and twist. The desert wind whispered warnings, rustling her dress and tugging at Silas's coat. The future was uncertain, the stakes high, and neither of them truly knew what lay ahead. Still, as the sun dipped below the jagged cliffs, bathing them in the last light of day, Aiyana felt a spark of defiance. She had survived the judgment of townsfolk, the harshness of the desert, and the ghosts of her past. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same stubborn courage that had carried her this far, and now, with Silas by her side, the canyon itself seemed to echo a promise that survival could become something stronger than mere endurance. It could become trust, and maybe even love. The morning sun had barely begun its climb over the jagged horizon when dark clouds rolled across the desert, an unnatural shadow against the pale sky. Aiyana and Silas rode side by side on a small gray mare, the wind tugging at their clothes and hair. The usually familiar desert seemed alien, transformed into a forbidding landscape under the looming storm. "Looks like a storm's coming," Silas muttered, scanning the clouds with sharp, dark eyes. His hand rested lightly on the bow strapped to his saddle, his muscles taut beneath his weathered vest. The air was electric, heavy with the scent of ozone and the promise of rain, an unfamiliar gift in this arid land. Aiyana's grip tightened on the reins, but she did not speak. She had lived long enough in the desert to know that storms were not merely weather, they were tests. She could feel the first fat drops splattering against her cheek, mingling with the dust of the plains. They were miles from town, and the nearest shelter was a narrow canyon, barely more than a crack in the earth. Silas nudged the mare toward it, the animal's hooves kicking up clumps of dry soil that instantly turned to mud under the first hints of rain. By the time they reached the canyon, the sky had unleashed its fury. Rain fell in sheets, hissing against stone, turning the sand into slippery mud and filling shallow grooves with rushing water. Aiyana slid from the mare, boots squelching, her dress clinging to her in damp folds. Silas followed, his tall frame towering above her, chest glistening with rain and dust. Despite the storm, he moved with deliberate calm, surveying the canyon for shelter. "There," Aiyana said, pointing to a small overhang just above a trickling stream. It was little more than a shallow nook in the rock, but it would keep them from being drenched and perhaps from sliding into the canyon's sudden rivulets of water. Together, they led the mare to higher ground, securing the animal before huddling under the rocky shelter. The storm raged around them. Lightning flashed, illuminating Silas's muscular frame, glistening with rain and his tribal jewelry catching the brief, bright light. The roar of thunder shook the rocks above, and the wind whistled through the narrow canyon. Aiyana shivered, but Silas draped his coat over her shoulders, the warmth of his body pressing against hers. "I've never seen a storm like this in the desert," Aiyana whispered, her voice trembling with awe and fear. Silas shook his head. "Nature's not gentle. Out here, you adapt or you don't survive." His eyes softened as they met hers. "And you? You've adapted, haven't you?" Aiyana nodded, thinking of the years she had spent fending for herself, surviving the harshest conditions the West could throw at her. She felt the rain soaking into her hair, but a strange calm settled over her. Survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about relying on another person, trusting someone else to share the burden. And for the first time, she realized she trusted Silas. They spent hours under the rocky shelter, the storm battering the canyon walls, turning sand into mudslides and sending water rushing in small rivulets through the rocks. Silas showed her how to channel the water into a small pool, using stones to block the rush and create a trickle they could drink. Aiyana helped, amazed at his resourcefulness, feeling a sense of partnership forming, as if the desert itself demanded cooperation. By the time the storm passed, leaving a fresh sheen over the canyon rocks and a small rainbow arching across the horizon, both were drenched but alive. The desert, harsh and unyielding, had tested them, and neither had faltered. Silas finally broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "We survived, together." He extended his hand to Aiyana, mud dripping from his fingers, and she grasped it firmly. The rain had washed the dust from their skin, but it could not wash away the bond that had formed in the storm. Aiyana looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the storm-slick rocks and the glimmer of the rainbow. "Together," she echoed, a smile breaking through the weariness as they mounted the mare and rode back toward the town. The desert seemed less threatening, the canyon less forbidding. They had faced nature's wrath and emerged united, a silent understanding bridging the gap between their pasts. And in that moment, Aiyana knew that whatever trials lay ahead, she would not face them alone. The rattling of the train over the wooden trestle echoed like a heartbeat through the desert night. Aiyana clutched the edge of the seat, eyes wide as the wind whipped her dark hair across her face. Silas sat across from her, muscles tense, the shadows of the flickering lantern casting sharp lines across his shirtless frame. Even in the dim light, the glint of his tribal jewelry caught her eye. Each bead and feather a reminder of the strength he carried within him. "This track leads straight through the canyon," Silas said, his deep voice calm but alert. "We shouldn't be out here if we can help it." Aiyana swallowed, trying to steady herself. She had agreed to the train ride, thinking it a moment of peace after the storms and hardships. But the desert night had a way of turning ordinary journeys into tests of survival. The whistle shrieked in the distance, and the wind rattled the open car, carrying with it a scent she hadn't smelled in years, a scent of smoke. Leather and horses that sent a shiver down her spine. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the distant tracks, silhouetted by the lanterns of the moving train. Aiyana's heart stuttered. Silas's eyes narrowed, muscles coiling like a spring ready to snap. The man riding toward them was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat and a leather duster that flapped violently in the wind. But it wasn't his clothes that made Aiyana's stomach twist. It was the familiarity of his posture, the sharp curve of his jaw, the haunted intensity in his eyes. "Jared." She breathed, her voice barely audible. Silas's gaze snapped to her, dark and questioning. "Who is he?" My past," she admitted, her hands trembling on her knees. "Someone I thought I'd never see again." Jared rode alongside the moving train, gun resting loosely across his lap, eyes locked on Aiyana. "Aiyana, stop!" he called, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. Memories of fear, longing, and betrayal surged through her. Years ago, she had escaped him, leaving behind a life filled with impossible choices. She had survived by running, surviving alone, and burying that chapter of her life deep beneath layers of dust and secrecy. Silas rose, his broad shoulders and muscular frame tense, shadowed by the lantern light. His dark eyes studied Jared with the scrutiny of a man who knew violence could erupt at any second. "You're not welcome here," he growled, his voice low but deadly. Jared's lip curled into a sneer. "I just want to talk. I have answers. Things you should know, Aiyana." Aiyana's heart pounded. She could see the anger flicker across Silas's face, dark, powerful, and terrifying. But beneath it was a restraint, a decision not to act rashly. Silas's hand hovered near his bow, his long hair falling over his face in the wind, beads and feathers glinting faintly, catching the last light of the train lanterns. "I don't need answers from him," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I survived him once. I don't need him to define me again." The train rocked violently as it crossed a narrow bridge, and Jared had to steer his horse sharply to keep pace. Silas stepped closer to Aiyana, his presence both protective and reassuring. "Then we deal with this together," he said quietly, his voice steady, carrying the weight of authority and care. Aiyana nodded, gripping his arm. She realized something vital: her past would always follow her, but it was her choice who shaped her present. Silas had already proven he could handle her truths, her secrets, and the storm of her past. Together, they were stronger than the ghosts that tried to haunt them. Jared's horse faltered on the uneven terrain, forcing him to retreat slightly. Silas's dark eyes never left him. "Go home," Silas called, voice resonant with calm authority. "You have nothing to do with her now." For a tense moment, the desert wind roared, echoing across the canyon, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and dust. Jared hesitated, then disappeared into the night, leaving only the echo of hooves and a silence thick with relief and unspoken understanding. Aiyana exhaled, leaning against Silas's broad chest, feeling the heat and strength of him solidify her sense of safety. The desert night was wild and unpredictable, but as long as they faced it together, no shadow from the past could break them. The train rattled on, carrying them toward a horizon painted with possibility, the wind whispering through the canyon like a promise. The past could follow, but the future was theirs to define. The sun had barely breached the horizon when Aiyana and Silas rode toward the edge of the desert, the wind carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. In the distance, partially swallowed by creeping desert flora, they spotted an old Spanish mission, its whitewashed walls cracked, wooden doors hanging crookedly, and the bell tower leaning slightly as if bowing to the years it had endured. This place, Aiyana breathed, dismounting her mare. "I've heard stories. They say it's haunted, abandoned, but it looks alive somehow." Silas studied the mission with narrowed eyes, his dark gaze sweeping over the crumbling walls. Muscles flexed under the sun as he dismounted, the beads and feathers of his tribal jewelry catching the early light. "It's a shelter," he said simply, "and maybe it can be more than that. We can make it a place to start again." Together, they pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the hinges protesting with a groan that echoed through the empty halls. Dust motes floated in the streams of sunlight piercing broken windows. The air smelled of old pine, dry earth, and something sacred time itself seemed to linger here, watching, waiting. Silas led Aiyana inside, showing her a collapsed alcove that could serve as a sleeping area. She traced her fingers over the old, faded murals depicting saints and pilgrims, feeling the rough texture of plaster beneath her skin. "It's amazing," she whispered. "All this history, and now it's ours for a little while." Silas smiled faintly, a rare softness in his dark eyes. "History doesn't define you, Aiyana, but it can remind you of what's worth preserving." They worked side by side, lifting fallen beams, stacking bricks, and clearing debris. Silas moved with careful precision, each motion reflecting both strength and patience. Rain from the night before had softened the desert soil, leaving a faint scent of wet earth that mixed with the mission's lingering musk. Aiyana marveled at his methodical focus, noticing how even his shirtless frame muscles taut under sweat and dust exuded an aura of quiet protection. By midday, they had cleared the main chapel, and Silas fetched water from a nearby spring. Together, they washed the dirt and sweat from their hands, sharing a brief, intimate moment of relief. Aiyana noticed the small details, the way the light caught the curve of Silas's jaw, the gentle tug of his long hair across his forehead, and the faint shimmer of his tribal jewelry in the sunlight. The warrior who had once seemed untouchable now felt human, vulnerable in ways that mirrored her own. "I didn't think I could ever stay in one place," Aiyana admitted, her voice low as she rested against a half-standing wall. "But here, it feels like maybe I could." Silas knelt beside her, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. "You can," he said firmly. "It doesn't matter what's behind us. We're alive, we're together, and we've survived everything the desert has thrown at us. This," he gestured around the mission, "can be ours to build, to protect, to heal." Aiyana's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. She felt a weight lifting from her chest, the judgment of the town. The shadows of her past, even the scars of her own choices, seemed to ease under the warmth of Silas's presence. The mission, with its cracked walls and broken doors, became a symbol, beauty in imperfection, resilience in decay, and hope and survival. As the sun dipped toward the western cliffs, casting long, golden rays through the broken windows, Silas and Aiyana stood together in the main chapel. Dust swirled around them, lit by the amber glow of evening light. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to imagine a future, not one defined by fear, secrecy, or survival alone, but by trust, partnership, and the possibility of healing. The mission, abandoned and forgotten by the world, had become a sanctuary. And in that quiet, sacred space, Aiyana realized that she could finally let the past remain where it belonged, in the shadows of the desert, while she and Silas forged a life grounded in strength, love, and the courage to face whatever came next. The first light of dawn stretched across the desert, casting the mesas and canyons in warm, golden hues. Silas led Aiyana to a secluded plateau where the Apache tribe had gathered. Muscular warriors stood in ceremonial formation, their bodies painted with ochre and charcoal, feathers woven into their long hair, and beaded jewelry glinting in the sun. The air was thick with the scent of sage, leather, and burning cedar. "This is where I prove myself," Silas said quietly, glancing at Aiyana. His shirtless frame, taut with muscle and adorned with tribal jewelry, caught the sunlight with every movement. His dark eyes held determination and a hint of vulnerability she had rarely seen. "If I cannot show them I am worthy, I cannot protect what matters most to me." Aiyana's chest tightened. She had seen Silas face danger before, but this test was different. It wasn't about survival against outlaws or the harsh desert. It was about honor, trust, and proving himself to an entire tribe who had watched him from the shadows. "I'll be right here," she said, taking his hand. "I trust you." Silas nodded, and the ceremony began. The warriors stepped aside as he moved to the first trial, the fire leap. 2 lines of smoldering embers were set, and the ground was scorched. Silas crouched, muscles coiled, and leapt with perfect precision, landing without falter. Aiyana gasped, not at the danger, but at the grace and strength that radiated from him. Next came the canyon climb. A sheer cliff face loomed, dotted with natural handholds and ropes woven from leather. Silas ascended with ease, his bare skin scraping against stone, beads and feathers swinging from his arms. Aiyana's pulse quickened with each footfall he made, imagining the consequences if he slipped. Yet he moved with careful precision, every motion deliberate, every breath measured. Finally, the water trial awaited him. A rushing river, swollen from recent desert rains, challenged his endurance. The warriors had to cross it by swimming against the current while carrying symbolic tokens of their strength. Silas dove in, muscles straining, hair plastered to his back, eyes dark and focused. The cold water lashed against his body, but he pressed on, gripping the token and pushing forward until he emerged. Soaked but triumphant, Aiyana rushed to his side, brushing wet hair from his face. The desert sun reflected on his glistening muscles, the beads and feathers of his jewelry catching the light like tiny stars. "You did it," she said, awe and relief mingling in her voice. Silas looked down at her, chest heaving, dark eyes softening. "I did it? For you?" The tribe's elders nodded, their expressions approving. Aiyana realized the significance of the trials. Silas had not only proven his physical strength, but also his commitment, humility, and capacity for loyalty. The challenge had been a test of heart as much as body. The wind swept across the plateau, carrying with it the scent of desert sage and the distant echo of ceremonial drums. Silas extended his hand, and Aiyana took it, feeling the roughness of his skin, the warmth of his grip, and the unspoken promise that no trial, past or future, would separate them. They stood together, watching the tribe return to their rituals, the sun painting the desert gold and crimson. Aiyana felt a profound respect for the man beside her, more than she had ever known, more than words could express. The trials had tested him, and he had emerged stronger, more steadfast, and utterly devoted. "Whatever comes next," Silas murmured, voice low, "we face it together. The desert, the past, the world. Nothing will break us." Aiyana smiled, pressing her forehead against his chest. The wind carried away the tension of the past, leaving only clarity, strength, and a shared determination. The Apache Plateau, wild and sacred, had witnessed the forging of trust and love, a bond as enduring as the desert itself. The desert stretched endlessly, its jagged rocks and golden dunes bathed in the soft light of early morning. Silas led Aiyana toward a hidden spring he had discovered years before, a place whispered about among the Apache as sacred, a place of clarity, healing, and vision. The journey had been long and silent, the desert wind carrying only the sound of their footsteps and the faint whisper of distant birds. "This place," Aiyana murmured as the spring came into view, water sparkling like liquid silver among the rocks. The air was scented with desert flowers and the freshness of running water, a stark contrast to the arid land they had traversed. "It feels magical." Silas, shirtless and muscular, his long black hair falling over his shoulders, beads and feathers in his tribal jewelry glinting faintly in the sun, knelt by the water's edge. "It's said that those who enter the spring with truth in their hearts can see their past and future clearly," he said, voice low, carrying both reverence and caution. Aiyana knelt beside him, dipping her fingers into the cool water. The sensation was electrifying, washing away the dust and tension of the desert. Silas followed, the muscles in his arms and shoulders taut as he bent to touch the water, his reflection rippling across the surface. She saw not only his strength but a depth of vulnerability rarely revealed, a warrior, willing to face both danger and the heart's truths. "I've carried so much," Aiyana whispered, her voice trembling. "Shame, fear, regrets. I thought they defined me." Silas reached for her hand, rough skin brushing hers, grounding her. "Your past is part of you, yes? But it doesn't dictate your future. We decide who we are together every day." The spring shimmered as if acknowledging his words, the water catching the sunlight and scattering prisms across the rocks. Aiyana leaned forward, letting her reflection merge with the ripples. In the water, she saw visions of her life, the choices she had made, the desert she had crossed alone, and the moments of quiet strength that had kept her alive. Silas's reflection appeared beside hers, unwavering, strong, and protective. "You've survived everything," he said, voice steady. "And now we survive together." Aiyana let the water wash over her hands and face, feeling the weight of her past loosen with each drop. The desert, once harsh and unforgiving, now seemed to bow in recognition of their journey, the storms, the trials, the secrets, the confrontations. Every hardship had led them here, to clarity and unity. Silas stood, extending his hand to her, water dripping from his strong, glistening frame. She took it without hesitation. Together they waded fully into the spring, the cool water enveloping them. It was more than cleansing. It was a baptism of trust, resilience, and rebirth. Around them, the desert seemed to bloom, small desert flowers pushed through cracks in rocks, the air thick with life and possibility. For the first time, Aiyana allowed herself to feel free, not free of her past, but free from its hold over her. Silas's presence was a steady anchor, a living promise that they could face any danger, any judgment, and any secret as long as they remained united. They rose from the spring, water cascading from their hair and clothes. Silas brushed a strand from Aiyana's face, dark eyes soft yet intense. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we face it together. Nothing can undo this. Nothing can break us now." Aiyana smiled, pressing her forehead to his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heartbeat, the warmth of his skin, and the steady assurance that they had endured the worst the desert could offer. The sun climbed higher, painting the canyon in brilliant gold and crimson, reflecting the redemption they had earned not from others, but from themselves. As they walked hand in hand back toward the desert plains, the spring glimmered behind them, a sacred witness to their journey. The trials, the revelations, the storms, and the challenges had forged a bond stronger than fear, secrets, or pain. In the vast, wild landscape of the Old West, they had found trust, courage, and the rarest treasure of all, each other.